Good morning, First Missionary Baptist Church family and friends, and welcome to Sunday School. Good morning, everyone. Today is Sunday, September 18th, and I'm Ovetta Hobson, and I will lead in the Sunday School lesson discussion today. So this week we continue our series of lessons in Unit 1 of the fall series, in the lesson or the unit titled God Calls Abraham's Family. It continues a story of Jacob and Esau with a slant toward Jacob's journey and Jacob's struggle this week. The title of the lesson is Persevere in Times of Difficulty. Persevere in times of difficulty. It tells of difficult days and trials and struggles with a backdrop of deceit, scheming, and manipulation. It tells a story of a struggle, and it's a real struggle. It's not a dream. Now, you know Jacob was known for dreaming, but this isn't the story of a dream. This is a real struggle. He had a struggle with a man, or at least a person that he thought was a man at the time, but really finds out that he's having a struggle with God himself in the presence of an angel. Now, Jacob might have been the first person to coin the phrase, the struggle is real. Now, let's talk about a struggle for a minute. Nobody really wants to struggle. Who wants to struggle? Who wants a difficult time? Nobody really wants that. It's just not in our human nature to go looking for a struggle. However, in life, sometimes we have struggles. In life, in life, we will have struggles. In life, we will have difficult times. Frederick Douglass said, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Bishop Vashti Murphy McKenzie, the first female bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, wrote a book about leadership development for African American women in ministry, and she appropriately titled that book, Not Without a Struggle. Now, many of the things that we desire in life come not without a struggle. We are the beneficiaries of blessings not without a struggle. Some of life's most rewarding experiences are had not without a struggle. And some of our life's greatest lessons come not without a struggle. And sometimes it takes a struggle. Sometimes it takes a trial for us to hear and to encounter God. So while we consider a struggle being not such a nice thing, not such a nice experience, sometimes it is in the struggle that we find God. So now the lesson is broken down into two different sections, two different sets of scripture from Genesis, the 32nd chapter. And in those two sets, we're going to look for life lessons in trials, and we're also going to consider what may happen or what we have when we actually encounter God. Now, last week we talked about the story of Jacob and Esau, the twins, and how the younger twin received the blessing as opposed to the older twin, which was a customary practice of choosing the older twin. That was a customary practice that the older twin would receive the blessing because of his birthright. Now, there was some trickery behind it, but nevertheless, the younger twin was chosen. Ironically, the lesson was taught by a twin. It was taught by a younger twin, in fact, Deacon Melvin McCann. Deacon Melvin McCann told the story of the family dynamic, or rather the family dysfunction, I would say, that, as he put it, included competition, extreme favoritism, and manipulation for selfish gain. That's a lot. The lesson started with the twins struggling and wrestling with each other, even in the mother's womb. Even before they were born, there was a struggle. And it continued with Jacob being born in wrestling mode. You remember, he came out holding his brother's heel, pulling on his heel, wrestling with his heel. Jacob was born as a supplanter. grabbing Esau's heel and trying to remove him from his proper place. That's really what supplant means, to do, to move you, to displace you, to oust you, to get you out of the way, to usurp your power, if you will. So he was really born as a deceitful person. He conned, and that's literally what he did. He conned Esau out of his birthright and displaced him from his rightful position as the firstborn son. So from pre-birth, Jacob was known as a wrangling wrestler and a deceptive deceiver. Now, what's missing between what Deacon McCann taught last week and where we go today is really the fact that Jacob continued in that lifestyle. He continued with manipulation. He continued with his cunning and conning. Now, with the help of his mother, Rebekah, we know that he deceived his father, Isaac, out of the blessing that was reserved for Esau. And this set off a course of events that literally made Esau want to kill, or really made him vow to kill his own brother. And that took Jacob out of his homeland, out of his hometown, and displaced him, sent him, had him leaving, running for his life, fearing, of course, that his brother was going to kill him. His mama told him to go to her brother's place, her brother Laban's place in Haran, and stay there for a while until Esau cooled off. So, well, you know, that cooling off period ended up being about 20 years. But at any rate, at a young age, although he was coached by his mother, he declared a major in tricknology and a minor in manipulation. He used his intellect, he used his cunning to take advantage of people, to manipulate situations, and he started at home. He started with his own brother and his own father. But it seemed that tricknology actually ran in Rebekah's family, because once he got to Haran and got to know his kinfolk, his uncle Laban did a little trickery of his own, didn't he? He was a trickster just like Jacob. So Jacob got there, and he got, to be a victim of his own tricks. Jacob saw Rachel, that was his uncle's daughter, his cousin, and she was beautiful, and he wanted to marry her. And Laban said, okay, but you're going to have to work for her for 7 years. And then at the end of the 7 years, he tricked him and made him marry who? Leah, the older daughter, because the older daughter was supposed to have her hand in marriage first. But Rachel looked so good to him, and he wanted Rachel so bad, he said, well, what do I have to do? So he told him, okay, you can work for another 7 years, and then you can have Rachel as well. And this is exactly what he did. So between the two wives and their handmaids, he had 12 sons and a daughter, and there was a whole lot of drama behind that. Y'all remember, I'm not making this up. You have to read it. I mean, I can't make this stuff up. It's better than watching any of the Real Housewives episodes, right? So just read the Bible for that kind of drama. So Jacob couldn't be outdone by this old man. He refused to let his uncle father-in-law Laban have the last trick. Jacob was a trickster, and you can't trick a trickster, right? So he paid the favor back by tricking Laban out of his livestock by making a pact about Laban giving him all of the spotted livestock and him keeping the solid for himself. And of course, then Jacob, being the trickster, figured out a way to breed the whole flock as spotted, so then he ended up stealing the whole flock from his uncle father-in-law. He, I guess, conducted the world's first sheep scam, and he scammed them out of his sheep. So after the sheep scam, he packed up the sheep and left town with his uncle father-in-law Laban, furious and chasing behind him. Now again, read it in the Bible. I'm telling you, it's true. It's better than watching Power Book 2, 3, and 4. So the lesson today picks up with Jacob being told by God to return to his hometown, to return to the town where his brother Esau, who vowed to kill him, is there waiting for him. Again, the lesson title today is persevere in difficult times. And certainly Jacob is facing a difficult time at this particular point in time. It's 20 years after he left home empty-handed. He was again fleeing his brother's anger and his brother's murder threats. Now he's a wealthy man, married with wives and children, and God has told him to go home. He's leaving a difficult situation, and he's headed toward a difficult situation. He's leaving 20 years of difficulty with Laban, and he's headed back toward 20 years of anger building up and festering in his brother at home. Some difficult times. And then, to top that off, he finds out that Esau really isn't even waiting for him at home. Esau's on the way to meet him. And besides that, he's got 400 men with him. Difficult times. He can't go back because he just burned the bridge with Uncle Father-in-law, and he's afraid to go forward because he fears that Esau is going to kill him. Ladies and gentlemen, this constitutes a difficult situation. This is a struggle, and nobody likes a struggle. Especially nobody like Jacob, especially not a trickster who has managed to deceive his way and trick his way out of every sticky situation he's ever encountered. Now he has to confront, if you will, a life that's been filled with all of this drama and this deceit and wrestling to get the upper hand. He's always been able to get what he wanted by deceptive methods. Time and time again, he's failed to listen to God. He's failed to take God at his word. He's failed to trust what God has planned, and he's always taken matters into his own hands. And the problem here is it's worked out pretty good for him. So he continues to do the same pattern of taking matters into his own hands. And even at this pivotal moment in his life, in true Jacobian fashion, he doesn't necessarily look to God. He starts scheming. He starts to scheme, he starts to plot, and he starts to plan to figure out what his next move is going to be. Got a side note for you here. Regardless of how clever our plans may be or how smart we think we are, our plans are in no way comparable to and can never displace God's ultimate plan and design. I don't care how smart we are, we're just not smarter than God's design. So Jacob makes a plan to divide his family and his animals into two groups in hopes of saving at least one half of them. If, Esau and his men get this half, at least maybe he's got the other half saved. Then he decides to send gifts ahead to his brother. I'm going to send some gifts and, maybe impress him with my wealth or give him something that he wants, and maybe that'll, chill him out or mellow him out a little bit, and, maybe that'll make it a little bit easier. It sounded like a good plan. And maybe it was. And I know I've been a little hard on Jacob up to now, but I do want to make a very important statement that in the text, just prior to where the lesson text takes up today, in verses 9 through 12, it states, "Then Jacob prayed." Then Jacob prayed. Now, when you read the whole narrative, if you read back, in just maybe starting chapter 30 and on up, very seldom do you see where it says that Jacob prayed. It really doesn't say that much that he prayed. It says that he schemed, that he plotted, he came up with these plans, and he devised this thing to get by. But very rarely do you see where it says Jacob prayed. Now, even now, after he had made his plan and after he had sent his family ahead, made this plan to save his family, it says, "Then Jacob prayed." There's another side note for you. Pray before you plan. Maybe your plans will come out a little bit better if you pray before you plan. Whenever we get on the road, my mom always tells us, pray before you get to the praying mile. Pray before you set out. Pray before you have this great destination or this great plan or this journey in mind. Pray before, and maybe, just maybe, God will give you a better situation. Now in verse 11, it says, when he prayed, it says that he says in his prayer, "Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me." Pray, save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, because I'm scared he's going to kill me. It just got real for Jake. It just literally got real because the thought of his brother coming to take his own life, the struggle just got real. He came to the realization that it was about to go down. So he prayed in that moment, "Save me." Another side note for you here, difficult situations will make you pray. So here's where the text of the lesson starts. Finally, we'll get to it, where Jacob has the encounter with the angel. It's Genesis chapter 32, and I'll start with the 22nd verse. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So Jacob sends his family and the rest of his possessions over the brook Jabbok ahead of him, and there he is, left alone and afraid. And while he's left alone by himself, he finds that he's in a position where he has to confront his own limitations and weaknesses. Now, Jacob, who's known for being able to wrestle himself out of any situation, to use all of his good wrestling maneuvers, his cunning maneuvers, he's faced with a wrestling match that, he can't use his cunning, his wits, his smarts. He can't use his abilities to devise a clever exit. He's between the proverbial rock and the hard place. He had a struggle ahead of him and one behind him. But what he doesn't realize is that he's about to engage in the struggle of his life just where he is. He's about to lock up with God himself. Rebecca isn't there to help him make a scheme. Isaac isn't there to bless him. Rachel isn't there to love him. He's facing this struggle all by himself. But ultimately, there is a purpose in this struggle. I mean, he's just not struggling for nothing. And that's the thing. God doesn't necessarily just let us struggle for grins. God, there's always some purpose in our struggle. So he's found at a trial, at a difficult time, alone by a brook. He had to be removed from the crowd for a minute. So now I told you we're going to learn some lessons in trials. So the first lesson that we need to learn when we're in a trial is that God uses trials to get our attention and to focus us on him. God sometimes uses trials to grab our attention and make us focus on him. And sometimes God needs to get us alone to get our attention and get us to focus on him. Sometimes struggle can get us out of the busyness and the obsessions of life. Sometimes struggles have to get us to a point where it's just us and God. Nobody but us and God. And then we can focus on him. Jacob was obsessed with what was ahead of him. He was obsessed with Esau wanting to kill him. He was consumed by this threat. And see, when the busyness and the circumstances of life hinder our time with God, then sometimes God has to put us in a struggle to remove that hindrance. Sometimes he has to separate us from the crowd in order for us to see him. See, God wanted to do something great. He wanted to do something wonderful and something special with Jacob. He wanted to show him something, to make him something, but he had to pull him away from the crowd. He had to get him by himself to do it. And Jacob was so consumed, so consumed that he couldn't even see God in the situation. He was consumed with the situation itself, and he couldn't even see that God was literally in front of him in the situation. And that's what happens in our lives sometimes. Too many times we get in a situation and we get so focused on what's happening to us. We get so focused on, I'm having a hard time. It's just so difficult on me, until we cannot even see that God is right there in the middle of the situation with us. So our faith becomes overcome by our fear, and then we fail to rely on God. We see everything and everyone except God. So sometimes struggle comes to separate us and bring us closer to God. So this man, who in fact was God in the form of an angel, comes down to wrestle with Jacob. Another side note: God loves us so much until sometimes he gives up his divinity and comes down to see about us. Hint, hint, Jesus Christ. Now, wrestling was Jacob's thing. He was wrestling before he was born, and he was born wrestling with his brother's foot in a wrestling hole. So one might think that, the fact that God came at him in the form of a wrestler should have been no big deal for Jacob, since that was what he was good at. Now, when faced with this man and when faced with a wrestling match, Jacob probably said, oh, no problem. Is this what you want to do? You want to get down? You want to wrestle? This is what I do. I'm a wrestler. I'm a displacer. I'm a holder. I'm a usurper. I'm a WWF Stone Cold Steve Austin, Ric Flair, The Rock, Triple H sensation. This is what I do. We can do this. Let's get down. I know all the slick holes and the dirty moves. Come on and let's get it on. But the Bible said that the man wrestled with him all night. And when God got ready to end it, he just ended it. He just touched his hip and dislocated it just like that. The greatest asset that he had was gone and incapacitated. Now, in wrestling, the strength lies in the hips and the legs, the lower body. That's where wrestlers have such muscular lower bodies. But when his hip was dislocated, the fight was over and Jacob lost. Lesson number 2 in a trial: God uses trials to get us to recognize our weaknesses and our need for him. God uses trials to get us to recognize that what we think is a strength may actually be a weakness. And sometimes God has to do this with us. Sometimes our strengths will keep us away from God. When we start to feel so competent and confident in ourselves, sometimes we tend to fail to depend on God. Sometimes he has to take away something from us, to take away our perceived strength, to make us know that we still need him and we still have to depend on him. We let these strengths become our lowercase God. Sometimes he has to touch these strengths, our places of confidence. He has to take something away to make us depend on him. For some, he might have to take away some intelligence. For some, he may have to touch their bodies. For others, maybe he touches their finances. We've seen the great singer lose her voice. We've seen the phenomenal athlete lose his legs. We've seen the billionaire that lost his mind and all of his money. So whenever our pride, whenever our strength, our focus, and even our worship gets on something greater than God, something beyond God, something other than God, he just might have to take it away. And that's what he did for Jacob. God used wrestling, something that Jacob was good at, to let him know ultimately who was in control. It wasn't Jacob, it was God. And with a simple touch, he didn't say he did some kind of great maneuver or some body slam off the rope. He said he just touched his hip and ended it all. So sometimes trials come so that we can understand our weaknesses and know that even when we think we are strong, we have to depend on God. Now, you might further say, well, if God could have ended it at any point and proved his weakness and dependence, then why did the match go on all night? I mean, it could have been done in just a couple of minutes. You know, it went on till daybreak. And it didn't say that they wrestled for 2 minutes and then went to the corner and took a break and got some water. It said they did it all night long. They tangled up, they locked up all night long until daybreak. And God could have broken him down and made his point after 10 minutes of wrestling. But he didn't. Why? Well, because God sometimes wants to build up endurance in us. And God, through the trials, will give us endurance, give us grace to build endurance. Regardless of how good he was at wrestling, he still couldn't have endured on his own all night. I mean, come on, this is wrestling literally all night. He could not have endured without the grace of God. So again, God could have ended the wrestling match if he wanted to, but he didn't. Sometimes God lets us go through extended periods to build endurance, to build our strength. Sometimes he may be preparing us for something else, just as he was preparing Jacob. The choir used to sing a song called, "He is preparing me." You remember that song? He's preparing me. He's preparing me for something I can't handle now. He's preparing me for the next matter that I need to carry out in my life. So even though Jacob was no stranger to enduring hard times, he'd spent 20 years with Laban, he still took him through a night of grueling agony of wrestling to build his endurance, because he knew even greater was coming from Jacob, and he needed to have even more endurance. So when we're going through trials, we have to consider that God is building up our endurance and making us ready for something even greater. Romans 5 puts it this way: we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint. Trials build endurance. So in this overnight experience, we see that Jacob learned a lesson in endurance. He learned that even though when he had lost all of his strength, he could still hold on to God. He could still hold on to God. That's the next lesson in a trial. Regardless to how bad the situation may seem, hold on. Keep holding on to God. Even though the fight was over, his hip was dislocated, he couldn't wrestle anymore. He was spent, he was tired, he had been at it all night. You know, he was sick and tired. You ever been sick and tired, or being sick and tired? You've been in a situation so long until it's like, I just want to give up. Well, hold on. This is what Jacob did. He held on. The man told him, let me go, because daybreak is coming. Now, this is another side note, in some of my studies, I found it interesting that the significance of daybreak wasn't because the angel was afraid of daybreak. I mean, it was an angel. It wasn't like the angel was going to disintegrate or disappear as an angel, not a vampire. Daybreak wasn't going to hurt the angel. The consideration that in some of my studies says was that he was wrestling God, and he was wrestling God in the form of an angel, of course, but at night. And the fear was that when daybreak would come, he would see the angel's face. And no one had seen the face of God and lived. So the angel wasn't concerned about his own life. He wasn't concerned about himself. He was concerned about Jacob. He was like, you better let me go before the sun comes up. You know, you better let me go before it's too late for you. But Jacob made a statement that literally changed the whole narrative. He said, I won't let you go unless you bless me. I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me. So with this statement, Jacob, in that moment, in that night of wrestling, moved from a level to a whole other level of the awareness of God. He realized with whom he was. He realized who he was wrestling with. He finally realized that he hadn't been wrestling with an ordinary man all night. He was in the presence of somebody that could bless him. And in this trial, he realized that there's room for a blessing. So lesson number 5 in a trial: God blesses us in trials. Just hold on and wait for it. Jacob didn't give up. he held on and he waited for his blessing. Now in the text, it sounds like he demanded it, but consider his opinion. He really wasn't in a place to demand anything. Hip broken, fought all night, barely holding on, and at any time, honestly spoken, the angel just could have touched his hand and, broke the grip anyway. But Jacob knew that he was in the presence of God, and he wanted a blessing from God. Sometimes we get so caught up in our trials and in our difficult situations, we fail to be aware and recognize that God has been in it and through it with us the whole time. All we have to do is acknowledge his presence, acknowledge that we know he's there, acknowledge that he has never left us, and wait for our blessing. So I guess I want to move on so we don't extend or go over our time. Let's go quickly to the second lessons, which are lessons on an encounter with God. Just quickly going back over the trials. God uses trials to get our attention and focus on him. He uses them to get us to recognize our own weaknesses. He gives us grace to build endurance in trials. And regardless of how bad the trials may seem, hold on to God and wait for your blessing. So in the second set of scripture, starting with verse 27, I'll read it very quickly. The man said, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Then Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But the man replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. So now Jacob has realized that he has not only endured a trial, gone through a struggle, but he has also literally had an encounter with God. And from the last dialogue between Jacob and the angels, there are a few things that we can determine an encounter with God will bring. First thing an encounter with God will bring. An encounter with God leads to self-realization and confession. It leads to us becoming self-aware, and then that ought to push us to a confession. The angel asked Jacob what was his name, and how did he answer? He said, "Jacob." Now, why is this significant? Well, do you remember back there was a time when somebody else asked him about his identity, and he was dishonest about it? You remember his father, Isaac, he was coming in to get the blessing, and he had the goat's skin on his arm. His father asked him, who are you? What's your name? Who is this? And what did he say? He said, "Esau." Well, this time he comes clean. He answers Jacob. He owns up to his name. Now, we talked about it earlier that the name Jacob means supplanter, displacer, heel grabber, deceiver, usurper, somebody that's trying to get you out so I can get in. That's what his name meant. So finally, he said, "Yes, my name is Jacob. I am a Jacob." This was not only a self-realization, but it was confession. It was confession to God. He said, I'm a Jacob. I've spent my life being a Jacob. I've spent my life being a supplanter. I've spent my life being a deceiver. I've spent my life being a trickster. Now it's time for me to come clean. I'm a Jacob. And that's how it is with us when we come before God. It's time to come clean. First and foremost, he already knows it. He already knows. We can't give God any news flash. He already knows. But when we have an encounter with God, we need to confess for our own sakes. We need to stop fooling ourselves. We need to come clean with ourselves and with God, because confession makes us real. Confession makes us honest before ourselves and with ourselves and with God. And sometimes, regardless of how unattractive our name might be, and when I say name, I'm talking about character. Sometimes, regardless of how unattractive, we need to say our name. We need to own up to our name. We need to, if meanness is our name, we need to say our name. If spite is our name, we need to say our name. If malice, malevolence is our name, we need to say our name. We need to say it for ourselves, and we need to say it for God, because God will do something about it. Say your name. An encounter with God also brings with it a blessing. We just talked about it. When Jacob asked the man what was his name, he didn't even reply. He'd asked Jacob, Jacob answered, then he said, well, what's your name? He didn't even reply, or rather, he replied by giving him a blessing. He said, I'm not going to tell you my name. I'm going to show you my name. I'm going to show you that I am the one that can and will bless you. So he answers by doing something. He answers by giving him a blessing. Jacob spent his whole life scheming and plotting to get blessings, didn't he? He started with his brother and his father, spent his whole life scheming and plotting to get a blessing for God, but then it took a struggle. It took something difficult for him to realize that he didn't have to scheme and plot at all. He didn't have to trick anybody to get a blessing. All he had to do was surrender. All he had to do was trust. All he had to do was obey God. All he had to do was say his name, and he got a blessing. And it took a struggle, a trial, a difficult time for him to see that he can't trust in tricks. Tricks don't bring blessings. God can't be coerced. God can't be blackmailed. God can't be extorted. God can't be hoodwinked, schemed, or scammed. All he wants is a clean heart and pure motives. An encounter with God will bring you blessing. It'll clean your heart up. An encounter with God is also holy and sacred. He gave the place a holy name, Peniel, because a remarkable thing had happened there. He had seen God face to face, wrestled with God, and lived. He had been touched by God. The Bible said that his ancestors to this day still commemorate the physical place and the physical touch of that day. In the Jewish culture, it's not kosher for people to eat the sciatic nerve. You have to go to a kosher butcher and they discard that portion of the animal that they eat. They discard the sciatic nerve today, and that's actually where he touched. It's still kept holy and sacred. And when we have an encounter with God, it's a special thing. It's a very special thing. It's a remarkable. It's almost something that's too precious to talk about. And that ought to change our lives. When we have an encounter, a true encounter with God, we ought to leave changed. We shouldn't stay the same that we are. It ought to change something about us. We ought to consider it holy and sacred. An encounter with God also leaves a witness mark. It leaves an artifact. Jacob was strong-willed and self-sufficient, but that wasn't what God wanted from him. So in this encounter, God touched his hip, causing him to have a limp for the rest of his life. It left a permanent witness mark. Jacob had been relying on his own physical strength and mind instead of relying on God. So this limp not only indicated his surrender, the surrender of himself, but it was also a physical reminder that he had had an encounter with God, he had had a struggle with God, God had touched him, and God had blessed him. It was to bear witness that never again did he have to be a trickster, a scammer, or a schemer. It was just like the thorn in Paul's flesh. It was there to remind him of his dependence on God. He left him with a limp, maybe a little swag, a little, dip when he walked. It's kind of like that song by Jonathan McReynolds, just keep on walking with my limp, 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 limp. So he had that limp to remind him of God. Every time he walked, he thought about the grace of God. And finally, an encounter with God will change your name. We started to talk about it a second ago. It'll change your name. As I said, when I talk about changing your name, it really means character. Jacob's name represented his character. People used to name children certain things, to represent character. Now, we just name nice names. But sometimes, especially in these days, they were named because of something surrounding their birth. So, what the kind of name that we have, or the kind of person that we've become, the kind of baggage that a name carries with it, the kind of character we have, God can change it all. God can change it all just with a touch. All we have to do is realize that even though we've been through trials and struggles and wrestling with God, struggling with God, He still wants to bless us in unimaginable ways. God could have been done with Jacob a long time ago. 20 years of trickery, all these years in his entire life of being a trickster. But he didn't give up on him. He wanted to change him. But God wants us to be honest with ourselves and to be honest with him. And that's what Jacob did. He owned up to who he had been. And when he did this, God changed his name. He told him that he didn't want him to go by a name that signified that he was a deceiver, that he was a trickster. He wanted him to go by a name that indicated that he'd had an encounter with God. So I challenge each of us today that whatever name we may carry, or whatever character, whatever we have, baggage that we're carrying, if we stop struggling with God, if we stop struggling with God and seek an encounter, a genuine encounter with God, He'll give us a new name. Say your name. Say your name. It might be difficult to say because we all have names that we're not proud of. We all have things in our lives that may have caused hurt, names that have caused pain, names that have caused difficulty for others. We have some names. We have some things in us that aren't that attractive. But I declare, if you say your name like Jacob did, say, I'm a Jacob, and he'll change your name to Israel. Just say your name. If your name is tricky, he'll change it to honesty. Say your name. If your name is greed, he'll change it to generosity. Say your name. If your name is troublemaker, he'll change it to problem solver. Say your name. If your name is division, he'll change it to unity. Say your name. If your name is mean, he'll change it to kind. If your name is selfish, he'll change it to selfless. Say your name. If your name is hellraiser, he'll change it to peacemaker. If your name is anxiety, he'll change it to reassurance. If your name is hurt, he'll change it to healing. If your name is hate, he'll change it to love. If your name is fear, he'll change it to faith. If your name is despair, he'll change it to hope. Be strengthened by the struggle. Stop wrestling. Say your name. Say your name. Say your name, and he'll change your name. Amen. So pray with me as we depart. God, we're so thankful that you've been with us today. We thank you for your goodness, your grace, your mercy, your love, your kindness. And God, we just pray that we would have an encounter with you. God, draw us closer to you. Let our focus be on you, even if you have to remove us from the busyness and the circumstances of the day, God. We seek to be closer to you. We seek to hold on to you. We seek a blessing for you, God, and when you bless us, God, we'll do greater things. We can do even greater things, God. So we just pray, oh God, that you would be with this church family. Bless us in every way that we need a blessing. Bless our pastor, oh God. Please touch his heart, mind, spirit, and soul. Give him the things that he needs to do to carry out this matter and the next matters in his life. Bless this church congregation, 142 years strong, God. Bless each and every person, name by name, need by need. Build us together, bind us together, strengthen us in unity, oh God. Let us be reminded that you are the head of the church. God, that this church is yours, oh God, and we are here to serve you. We love you, God. We bless your holy name, and we just pray, oh God, that the rest of this day and the days to come would be filled with us giving you glory, giving you honor,